On the set of the Jerry Springer Show in the year 2000, a fight has broken out that will end in murder. Not right there on the set, but weeks after the recording, on the day that the episode aired, 52-year-old Nancy Campbell would be discovered brutally murdered inside her own home. Her killer would go on the run and try to get away with this, but when the lead up to such a horrific incident was quite literally televised, he wasn't going to get away with it for long. Hello and welcome to OUTLORE Podcast. I'm Eleanor, Neale, and in today's episode, we're in Florida in the year 2000, where the latest episode of Jerry Springer is airing on TV in a bar, and it's made one of the locals very angry. It's actually starring a local family. Well, I say family, more like a local messy love triangle. And one of them is sat in this very bar watching the downfall of his own romantic life broadcasted to everyone in the country. He was drunk and slurring his words, but everyone could tell just how angry he was. And soon he was stumbling home with only one thing on his mind: revenge. Now, before we get into this case, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that we talk about in this episode. We will, however, be covering a lot of sensitive topics, including domestic violence, murder, alcoholism, and abuse. If that is not something that you want to hear about right now, please feel free to click out, and hopefully I'll see you again with another episode soon. But before we dive into the Jerry Springer murder case, I'd just like to thank our sponsor for making this episode of Outlaw on YouTube possible, MyHeritage. MyHeritage is an easy-to-use family history research platform where you can delve into your ancestors' past and build out your own family tree. It is so easy to use. Simply fill in a bit of basic info like your parents and grandparents, and you're aware. I actually had the plan to gift my grandma a really detailed family tree for Christmas. I wanted to print it out and frame it all, and I'm on track with it, guys. It's so cute. So far, I've researched all the way back to the 1700s, which shouldn't really come as a shock because MyHeritage has access to over 36 billion historical records worldwide. That's insane. I didn't even know a number that big existed. I don't know if you guys remember, but a while back, I discovered that I had an ancestor called Mary who was living in Whitechapel in London at the exact same time that Jack the Ripper was actively killing the women in the area, which, first of all, gave me an existential crisis. Second of all, led me down a huge rabbit hole on MyHeritage researching Jack the Ripper's family tree. Now, I know what a lot of you are going to say. We don't actually know who Jack the Ripper is for sure, but come on, the guy that everyone alleges is Jack the Ripper, Aaron Kosminski. We did a whole YouTube short on him not long ago, but people believe that he could be the Ripper due to a supposed DNA match found on a shawl belonging to his fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes. And the way that this link was discovered and the reason that Aaron Kosminski is a big suspect in this case is because of tracing family trees. They traced the suspects from way back in the day, you know, during the initial police investigation. They tracked down their not their ancestors, what's the other way? Their descendants, and then they were able to test them for DNA, and that's how they got the DNA match to Aaron Kosminski. Seriously, I feel like I've unlocked a new hobby recently, searching up suspects from super old crimes on MyHeritage and almost doing my own investigative work, seeing where they were at the time, who they knew. But you know what I've also realised, and this did come as a shock to me because I am a northern girly through and through. I feel like I bleed Yorkshire tea, but my family really didn't want to budge from London for generations. I am what they call an English rose. But seriously, for like hundreds of years, my family were London girls. But not only can MyHeritage uncover all of your relatives from generations ago, detailing where they're from, who they married, the lot, but they also have technology that can restore old images with colour, which I just think is amazing. And again, such a great gift for your grandparents this Christmas. I've loved finding out more about my family history, and I know that you guys will too, whether it's for your own research or, like I say, a gift like I'm planning for my grandma. You can start building your family tree for free. And you can start your 14-day free trial by scanning the QR code on screen right now or by clicking the link down below in the description. So thank you again to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. Now, let's start from the very beginning of today's love triangle, because it wasn't always a triangle. It used to be a pair made up of Nancy and Ralph. Nancy Campbell was born in 1948 in Michigan, but she was 52 years old at the time of this case in 2000. She was a very private person. She lived a very normal life and tried to avoid turbulence as best as she could. And I guess we all do. Or most of us, at least, because there is another type of person who loves the turbulence of life and relationship drama. That wasn't Nancy, but it certainly was her husband, Ralph. And that is how this meek, sweet, gentle little lady appeared on the Jerry Springer show, having to air out her dirty laundry in front of the whole country. She never would have taken her issues on a TV show of her own accord. But lately, her and her husband Ralph had been having major issues. And we'll get to them more in a second, but what you need to know right now is that Nancy thought that going on this TV show could bring them back together. And tragically, it did the complete opposite and ended in horrendous violence. Nancy had already had quite a hard life before Ralph, bless her. She became a widow quite early in life, literally right after having a baby with her partner. So not only was she struck with unimaginable grief, but she was left a single mother, trying to care for her baby all alone. And she really dedicated her life to this little boy. She became the best mum that she possibly could. It was almost like she put her whole entire life on hold just to be this boy's mother. She stopped dating. She didn't put as much time or energy into herself. I mean, maybe there was the odd guy that came along every once in a while, but none of them really stuck around and nothing ever really came of it. That was until 1995, with her boy all grown up. Nancy decided now was the time to give love another chance. So a friend introduced her to an AOL chat room, which was like the very beginning of online dating. Before the apps, before the websites, there were just like big chat rooms, kind of like a Discord vibe, if you're familiar with that. And unlike today's dating apps, people didn't use real photos of themselves. It was just those like pixelated avatars or like some random photo of a cat that you found on the internet. They would have fake usernames. Well, not fake, but like, you know, like nicknames like Rugby Boy 09 and bullshit like that. But it was in this chat room where Nancy first met Ralph. She was in her late 40s at the time, so like 47 or 48, and Ralph was 12 years younger than her, making him in his mid-30s. But the two of them got on really damn well. Some reports even say that he was a single father too, although honestly we don't hear much about his kids in the research, so I can't imagine if he is a father that he was anywhere near as hands-on as Nancy was with her son, but still, it must have been nice to be able to bond over parenthood if that is the case. But a huge downside for this budding connection was that it was very long distance. Ralph was based all the way over in Germany, while of course Nancy is in Michigan. But the two of them loved talking to each other. It made them so giddy. And for about a year, the pair chatted and flirted online. By now, of course, they had shared actual pictures of themselves. They'd shared a lot of information about their lives. Their relationship was certainly forming into something more serious. And then one day, Ralph decided it was time to leave his life behind in Germany and run off to go and live with Nancy as his partner in Michigan. They finally saw each other in the flesh and very quickly married in what would have been like late 1997. It's kind of given 90 Day Fiancé, honestly. And just like many of the relationships in that show, Ralph and Nancy's marriage was a dumpster fire from day one. They argued like crazy. There was so much toxicity and jealousy and raised voices. They were just a nightmare together, honestly. But Nancy would put on a front to everyone else around them. She didn't want everyone to know truly how messy their relationship was, especially since they'd gone through all of this to make it work. A marriage, him moving across the world. It's kind of like sunk cost fallacy, that she just didn't want to admit that it wasn't going to work, so she kept trying to power through and pretend like it was fine. Nancy, as a person, was very easygoing. She was very calm and gentle, so it wasn't too hard for her to have this brave face on for others. But what many people didn't see was that Miss Nancy seemingly had a fiery side to her. The neighbours would hear the couple screaming and arguing all the time, and it sounded quite reciprocal. One of the neighbours, who could hear everything through the paper-thin walls, said that they fed off each other, and it was almost a fatal attraction, which is a haunting choice of words because it wasn't almost fatal, it would be fatal in the end. Soon after Nancy and Ralph were married, they moved to Bradenton in Florida, and they were struggling financially, which is important to note because it does come into this case a lot more later. Those plane tickets just to get to Florida would have been like a saving up kind of deal, you know? They didn't just have spare income like that. But by July 1998, so literally 1 year into married life, things took a really dark turn. Nancy filed a domestic violence complaint after Ralph threw her onto the floor, causing her to hit her head hard. And when this filing went to court, she actually begged the judge to keep Ralph away from her, saying that he was always making threats, saying that he would kill her, that he should have killed her before now, and that she deserved to die. And her final words to the judge were actually, "I do believe he will kill me," which makes you wonder about how reciprocal those screaming matches actually were. Maybe they sounded that way to the neighbours, but maybe Nancy wasn't giving it anywhere near as bad as she was receiving it. Maybe all this time in their short married life, she had just been fighting back and defending herself until she couldn't anymore, and she needed someone, the courts, to step in and protect her from this man. A statement like, "I believe he will kill me," is not an exaggeration. You take that seriously. That is a cry for help, and way too often, those cries are not heard until it's far too late. In early 1999, after about 15 months of marriage, Nancy and Ralph divorced. And I wish I could say that that is where their story ended, but obviously that is not the case, otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here discussing it today. After divorcing, Nancy and Ralph actually continued to see each other, and they were on and off again in their relationship. They even lived together again at some points. And as this case unfolds, you will see just how much Ralph controls and manipulates Nancy. Even though she is desperately trying to leave him, she's trying to get restraining orders, she's going to the court, but he is still managing to brainwash her and manipulate and worm his way back into her life every time. When you're abused and conditioned to that kind of abuse, you come to accept it and almost expect that that will be a part of love. Love feels incomplete without fear and danger. And we know on average that it takes someone, a victim of domestic abuse, 7 attempts to leave an abusive relationship. And that is the exact cycle that Nancy Campbell found herself in. Her story actually really reminds me of a case that we covered last year of a woman called Zazel Preston. This is a case that has really stuck with me. And it was the last episode that we created before I had to go on a few month-long break. This case really got me. Zazel Preston was a young mum who was abused over and over again by her boyfriend, all whilst trying to become a qualified domestic violence therapist. She was going to school for this. She knew so much about the abuse that she was being subjected to. She was practically an expert by the end. And still, her abuser was able to trap her back into his arms again and again through coercive control, intimidation, violence, love bombing. And you know what? I really urge you to give that episode a watch if you haven't already, because we actually used Zazel's own coursework on her studies to map out how abuse like this happens. It meant a lot to us that we could use Zazel's own knowledge and her own teachings in our episode, and that it's able to live on. You know, the work that she did will help other people, as her life was lost before she ever got to put any of that training into practice. But to continue on with Nancy and Ralph, as if things weren't toxic enough, Ralph goes and makes things a hell of a lot worse. He decides that the best way to fix a broken marriage is to add another woman into the mix. This new woman on the scene was coincidentally called Eleanor, and they shorten it to Ellie. So first off, before I say anything more, I just want to say I do not claim any of that energy. Please do not tarnish the good Eleanor name. But this Eleanor lady was quite the character. In fact, she was the total opposite of Nancy. She wasn't private, calm or quiet. She was loud and flashy and assertive. She was a belly dancer, a nature lover, a free spirit so full of life. And I truly think that all of that is what attracted Ralph. He saw her as the antithesis of his straight-laced ex-wife, Nancy. By early 1999, Ralph and Eleanor were officially together. Meanwhile, he is still on and off with Nancy, who had absolutely no idea that there was a new woman on the scene. But despite all of this secrecy and lies, Ralph was getting in deep with Eleanor. He had met all of her family. He was so integrated into her life. And then, oh my God, they get married! Secretly married in March of 2000. Nancy had no idea that Ralph had a new wife. She was still toxically tied to him and in the throes of his back and forth love bombing and ignoring. She didn't know that they were married, but she did know that Ralph had found a new woman. And when she did, she was so heartbroken because he's still actively leading her on, but also because she is just in love with him and she is so toxically tied to him. Nancy just wanted him back. She was mad at him, sure, but she just wanted everything to go back to how it was. She would write him letters begging for him to leave Eleanor and come back to her for good, which, acting so desperately like this, really shows how brainwashed and emotionally tortured she was by Ralph. She's consistently in a state of turmoil. Her anxiety is always shot through the roof, needing the person who hurts her the most back, likely believing that no one else would ever love her. Abusive relationships and coercive control take such a toll on someone's nervous system and their mental well-being. It's not just the physical attacks, it's ruining self-esteem, self-worth, and rationality. And of course, when Eleanor saw these letters from Nancy, let's be real, Ralph probably just straight up showed her the letter from Nancy, because I'm sure he loved the fact that two women were fighting over him. So anyway, Eleanor sees this letter and she decides to respond to Nancy over email, telling her to back off, and she signed it off as Mrs. Ralf Panitz. Well, when Nancy read that email, her fiery side surfaced again, and she came back with a response that she also signed off with Mrs. Ralf Panitz, despite the fact that they were divorced, and Nancy didn't know that Eleanor and Ralph were actually married, and she was actually the new Mrs. Ralf Panitz. But right at this point in time, Nancy's thinking, no, I was his wife, you're just his girlfriend, and also, he'd been leading her on, let's not forget about this. For years after the split, he was still in her life. He was still living in her home every now and then. Like, she thinks that this Eleanor girl is just a flash in the pan. She has no idea that her ex-husband has married her. But this feud between Miss Nancy and Miss Eleanor made Ralph feel so alive. It sparked an idea for him, actually. This toxic love triangle that they had found themselves in would make great TV entertainment. This could be brought to the Jerry Springer Show. I'm sure the majority of you will be familiar with the Jerry Springer Show. It's a talk show that began in 1991, and it would bring on mostly random members of the public to hash out their issues on the telly in front of the nation. If you're from the UK, think Jeremy Kyle, obviously, which is not without its controversies over here as well, and you will see that Jerry Springer is exactly the fucking same over in America. But the guests that they would bring on this show are very vulnerable in some kind of way. They're always in a vulnerable position. They're there to talk about something very emotionally taxing, something very personal to them. But at the end of the day, it was for other people's entertainment to go on this show, which is dystopian enough as it is. I fucking hate the concept of shows like this. It's so exploitative. But what makes it even worse is that production staff knew that they could push the guests' buttons to make for good TV viewing. Guests have alleged that they were provoked into having literal fistfights on stage. They were encouraged to strip naked. People's trauma wasn't taken seriously at all. Like when the show would bring on a victim of incest and confront them with their abuser. Like, why the fuck would anyone ever even want to watch that? But what the Jerry Springer audience truly lived for were those drama storylines. Like, who's the father of the baby? Did he really cheat on her? Who's in the wrong? Who's the villain? So Ralph, Nancy, and Eleanor's situation was like peak viewing for the Jerry Springer show. They ate up stories of infidelity and love triangles. So in the spring of 2000, Ralph, who was now 40 years old and with zero common sense, thought it would be a great idea to write in and apply for the show. Which is also just incredibly narcissistic, isn't it? Like, he knows full well that he is putting both of these women through hell, mostly Nancy, let's be real, and the audacity of him taking it so public is frankly evil. And probably even another abusive tactic just to humiliate Nancy. If you've ever watched the Jerry Springer show, you know that it isn't about happy endings. They weren't bringing couples back together so that they could ride off into the sunset. It all thrived on drama and fights and chaos. Controversy was their bread and butter, and things were often taken way, way too far. The Jerry Springer show had a reputation for manufacturing the chaos on screen. They faced a lot of accusations from guests. Producers would essentially coach people on how to act out there on the stage. They would wind them up in the green room and push them to their limit until things would explode on the set. One guest said that the producers wound her up so much that the whole time I was in the dressing room, I was just getting angrier and angrier by the second, and I'm not an angry person. My heart was pounding. It felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I was tired, crazy, and ready to fuck it up. They weren't treating you sensitively. They weren't interested in what kind of impact all of this was going to have on you. It was all for the show. But probably the saddest thing was that the guests genuinely thought that they were there to get real help. One producer came out and said a lot of the guests were earnest. They literally did think that they were coming on to solve a problem. You wouldn't believe how many people said to me on the telephone, "I can't wait to meet Jerry. I really hope he can help me with this." Jerry didn't help anybody with any of it. He just stood there and did his thing. His thing being this nice guy performance, pretending to be a mediator, while honestly just shit-stirring and meddling with these very real problems that these people were struggling and suffering from. For most people, it sounds like a genuine nightmare to be on a show like this, but not for Ralph, who loved the attention. He loved how he was making Nancy suffer. I think there's a few different factors in why he applied for the show. Obviously, the public humiliation of his ex being the main one, but also for 15 minutes of fame, for a free plane ticket to Chicago to go and film the show. It was all rather appealing to him. So in May 2000, he called up Nancy and begged for her to come on the show with him. He said that he genuinely wanted to fix things. He tried to manipulate her in his usual way, but maybe that wasn't working, and maybe Nancy was unwilling to go on the show. So Ralph began to lie to her. He said that he was being threatened with deportation back to Germany, and if it did happen, he said that the show promised to buy him a plane ticket back to the States if he went and recorded this episode first. Obviously, it doesn't make any sense. What power does a TV show or a network have to bring deported individuals back into the country? Like, I don't know. But sadly, Nancy believed his bullshit. He wasn't going to get deported. He was just a liar and a manipulator. But now it wasn't just about her own feelings. And trust me, she did want him back. Or at least she thought that she did when she was so terribly brainwashed by his abuse. But now that he'd said all this about deportation, it wasn't about her anymore. It was about him as well, and she wanted to help him. After all, she did love him. And so she agreed to air out their drama on the Jerry Springer show. Bear in mind, Nancy is going into this and she has no idea of the fact that Ralph and Eleanor got married. She thinks that they're just together, and she is about to be confronted with this on the fucking Jerry Springer stage. Ralph had convinced Nancy that the two of them would be getting back together properly by the end of the show, that their appearance was just for them to be able to confront Eleanor and end that whole thing so that they could ride off into the sunset and rebuild their marriage together. But he must have told Eleanor the exact opposite. Or kind of the same thing, I don't know. But this fuck-ass man told her that they were going to go on the show and get rid of Nancy once and for all. He was playing these women against each other. The producers would hardly need to manipulate this one bit, since Ralph was doing it all by himself. Their situation already had all of the key ingredients for a classic Jerry Springer episode. Sex, humiliation, betrayal, spectacle, all building to one crazy, dramatic confrontation. And poor Nancy had no idea what she was walking into. The show was filmed in Chicago, which is an 18-hour drive from Florida. So fuck that. The show was going to pay for plane tickets for all three of them. And today, the average return plane ticket for that journey that came out really Yorkshire. It cost well over $250. And there was no way that Nancy or Ralph could afford that on such little notice. And this is the case for a lot of the show's guests. Being so reliant on production financially to get them there and back kind of traps them into doing whatever the producers want them to do while they're there, or the show can threaten to rescind that return flight home, which they had done to people multiple times, which is so fucked up. But in May 2000, Nancy boarded that 2.5-hour flight to Chicago and headed to the hotel that the show's production had put her up in for a few days. They do this for all of their guests, and actually that's part of the appeal for some people. Guests could treat it like a city break, an all expenses paid trip. Only it wasn't really all expenses paid. The price to pay was public humiliation. But, of course, every guest is told by the producers that their story will be different. Producers were smart, and they knew how to draw people in and talk to them as if they're the stars of the show, like they're in on it all. But they're not. They never are. When the three of them arrived, they were all split up. In fact, I think they'd probably arrived on different flights too to make this easier. But the point is, they weren't supposed to see or speak to each other before the show in order to save all of their real reactions and conversations for when the cameras are rolling. But for some reason, the show had put Ralph and Nancy in the same hotel and Eleanor in a completely separate one. So maybe they did indeed have intentions for Ralph and Nancy's paths to cross before filming. But why? Maybe if they were alone for the night, with Eleanor out of the way, after not seeing each other for a while, then some last-minute scandalous activity might spark the night before the show recording. And you know what? That is exactly what happened. Ralph figured out which room Nancy was in, and he went and knocked on her door. And when she opened it, she was so happy to see him standing there. Remember, this is what she wants and what she believes is going to happen. He wants her back, right? At least that's what he's saying. So she lets him in, and they spend the night together before the show the next day. They had sex the night before he was about to confront her on national TV with his other fucking wife. I mean, Nancy didn't know at this point that he was married, but fuck this guy. Genuinely, fuck this guy. Poor Nancy has no idea what this man is truly doing to her. She thinks that everything is falling into place and fixing itself, finally, and the show is going to be a big factor in that. She thinks that Ralph wants her, and he will say that on the show tomorrow morning. Right? Well, when Nancy arrived at the studio, she was totally oblivious to the fact that she was about to have the rug pulled from under her. I don't know what the producers had been saying to her before the cameras started rolling, but it must have been a lot of sweet talk and false reassurance. And then it was time for the show to begin. Jerry Springer bounded out onto the stage and the audience began chanting his name like he was some prophet. And then he reads the promo for today's drama. Eleanor says her husband's ex-wife Nancy won't take no for an answer. Nancy has stalked them so severely that they had to go into hiding. Today, Nancy will learn that her ex-husband is actually married to Eleanor. Nancy couldn't hear any of this, mind you, she was being kept in the green room, and the first person welcomed up onto the stage was Miss Eleanor. She was there to tell everyone just how fucked up and weird Nancy Campbell was. She said that Nancy was batshit insane. She was a stalker that won't let Ralph go. She can't accept that he has moved on, and Eleanor claimed that it was making her and Ralph's married life a living hell. The audience are eating this up. Jerry's hyping up Eleanor to dish more dirt on Nancy. And then Nancy herself is brought out into the chaos. And my God, does she look like a deer in headlights. This was a total ambush. As she steps foot on the stage, the audience are already booing her. For the audio listeners, both the women are actually very similar looking. They're dark-haired women of similar sizes, similar heights. They look similar in age. but their demeanors couldn't be more different. Eleanor is bold and confident and, frankly, aggressive. Nancy is meek, timid, and awkward. I mean, of course you would be. It's her first second on the stage, and the audience are already making it very clear that she is the villain somehow. She must have been so confused. I mean, she's there thinking that she's going to fix things and ride off into the sunset with Ralph. Why would the audience dislike her? Why are they booing her? Eleanor rises from her seat and confronts Nancy head on, leaning right into her face, hands on her hips, practically yelling, "Ralph loves me. Ralph wants to be with me, and you red-headed bitch from hell, you need to leave us alone. You need to get a life." First of all, Jesus Christ, Eleanor, that's a bit much. But second of all, I am absolutely using redheaded bitch from hell from now on. That's going in my Instagram bio. That's going to be like on my dating apps. That's brilliant. The women have a bit of a back and forth, heavily encouraged by Jerry Springer, but Nancy doesn't engage much. Her body language and the stuff that she's saying is very short. She's kind of turned away. And the worst that she really gives it back to Eleanor was calling her trailer trash. But then, of course, in comes Ralf Panitz, the dirty dog of the hour, who is the whole reason why everyone is there. He strolls out, arms spread, thinking he's some kind of fucking god. Well, he firmly believes that he is God's gift to women. He confidently strides over to Eleanor and gives her a kiss on the lips, and then he walks over to Nancy and gives her just a kiss on the cheek. It's clear to see which side he is already taking, and it's truly heartbreaking to see Nancy realize this in real time. Her eyes lit up as he walked towards her. She smiles, her face softens because she thinks that this is the final step to getting him back. And despite watching him kiss Eleanor more intimately than he did her, it seems that she still believes it might end the way that he had promised her. Once Ralph had joined the party, the two women begin arguing again, and this is where Nancy reveals that she and Ralph had sex in the hotel last night. And it's kind of unclear if this is news to Eleanor or not. Maybe she already knew, because she doesn't react with that much shock. She just says stuff along the lines of like, "Oh, well, I hope you made the most of it, because it's never going to happen again." Seconds later, Ralph says, "Yes, I had sex with my ex-wife yesterday, but the matter of the fact, a month ago, I married Ellie, and I do love Eleanor." This is the first that Nancy has heard of the marriage, and she is visibly devastated. And it gets even worse. Ralph turns to her, and suddenly everything he'd been saying to her for weeks was turned on its head. He practically begs Nancy to leave him alone forever and let him get on with his new life, with his new wife, Eleanor. The audience are thoroughly entertained, watching Nancy's whole world fall apart live. But Nancy Campbell was a very strong woman. She hardly reacted, and she kept her cool the whole time, even though she was dying inside. She didn't give them anything. No tears, no outbursts, no spectacle for the show. She was just trying to maintain her dignity and composure. Remember, she wasn't the Jerry Springer guest type in the slightest. But that's not what the producers wanted, obviously. They wanted a scene. They wanted a humiliated woman breaking down, lashing out at her rival, and when they didn't get that, things needed to heat up. So in comes Jerry Springer himself, trying to provoke a reaction out of Nancy. He tells Eleanor to give it her best shot at humiliating her. And even he himself says to Nancy, he's telling you he doesn't want to be with you. To which Nancy just stands up, smooth as hell, and says,
"That's fine. Bye."
And she walks off stage. Unbothered queen. I really rate it. I mean, because obviously she wasn't unbothered at all, but what a power move to make it look like she wasn't. When Nancy goes backstage, the producers are fuming. They confronted her and they gave her an ultimatum. If she didn't get back out there on stage and finish the show, they weren't going to pay for her plane ticket home to Florida. Which, as I said, is a typical Springer threat. These shows preyed on people who didn't have the financial freedom to book their own flights. It was exploitative and classist as TV could get. They could essentially hold people hostage until they did what the producers wanted. But the threat didn't work. Nancy, humiliated and betrayed, refused to return to the show. They had lied to her, and she was done. So she left the studio. and she just walked through the streets of Chicago in floods of tears all alone and somehow found her way to the bus station. Remember, this was 2000. There were no iPhones, no Uber, no Google Maps to help her in a city where she knew nobody. And after a while, a good Samaritan sees Nancy crying at the bus station and offers to help. This sweet angel of a stranger bought her a bus ticket back to Florida, an 18-hour drive where all she did was ruminate and sob her eyes out over what had just happened to her. Not only had she been deceived, betrayed, rejected, but it was all so public. Everyone had seen her be humiliated, and God, even more people were going to see it when that episode went live on the television in front of the whole nation. Millions of people would see the worst moment of her life. Once Nancy was back in Florida, not one of the producers checked in on her or called her to make sure that she was okay. They just did not care. As far as they were concerned, she'd fucked them over by not causing a scene, so why should they care about her now? The guy running the show, Richard Dominic, literally said on this topic, "We weren't problem solvers. We're going to give you a chance to come on, tell your story, get it all out, but we're not going to help you." So then what's the fucking point in the show? Wasn't the aim for guests to go on with issues that the show could help to solve? Or was that just a front for exploiting these people? But whatever, as awful as that is, Nancy was just ready to move on with her life now. She would finally put Ralph in her past and stop thinking that he's going to come back to her and be nice to her. But by June 2000, literally just a month after the recording of that show, Ralph and Eleanor are already on the rocks. Are we shocked? As Taylor Swift once said, nothing good starts in a getaway car, you know? When they started to have their problems, of course, Ralph came crawling back to Nancy, begging her to take him back, saying that he was filing for divorce from Eleanor. He had made a huge mistake choosing her over Nancy, and it truly was Nancy that he wanted. And sadly, this worked. Bear in mind the years of abuse and mental torment and coercive control that Nancy had been subjected to by this man. She felt weak and worn down by his turbulence, and maybe it just felt easier and more familiar to just take him back and hope for the best. So Nancy and Ralph were officially back together a month after the recording, and the episode would be airing in a month after that. So they actually haven't seen the edit or anything like that yet, obviously. But during this time, between the recording and the episode going out, Nancy had actually put money down on a house for both her and Ralph to live in together in Sarasota, Florida. She was hoping that this was finally going to be their fresh start. But almost as soon as she put that money down on this house, Ralph went straight back to his old ways. He was threatening her, he was getting violent, he was throwing her out of her own house, the house that she fucking put the money down on. The cheek of this man. And so on the 10th of July, 2 weeks before their Springer episode was about to go live, Nancy filed a domestic violence injunction against Ralph, which is essentially a restraining order. It's a court order telling him to stay away from her, no contact, no showing up at her house, nothing, otherwise he will be arrested. But to get this approved, they all had to go to court. And there had been several instances building up to this, but obviously Nancy's final straw had been when he physically kicked her out of her own house. He'd even begun emailing Eleanor at this point in time asking for her back. He had flip-flopped that fucking quickly. And she agreed. And when she agreed to get back with Ralph, he moved her in to Nancy's house that he was living in. Like, what the fuck? What the fuck? The audacity of some of the men we talk about on this podcast is unmatched. I can't believe people exist out there that make these kind of decisions. Because also, not only did he move in Eleanor, his fucking mistress, but wait, are they still married? Yeah, they won't have had a divorce yet. But anyway, not only does he move her in, he also moves in his nephew, his like adult nephew, for some reason. I'm not sure. I guess that's less important, but it just shows you how much Ralph does not give a fuck about Nancy's home and her boundaries and her comfort. For a short time, all four of them lived together. Nancy, Eleanor, Ralph, and his random-ass nephew. This was once again a breaking point for Nancy, and she ended things with Ralf once again 2 weeks before their episode is set to air. So fucking much has happened in such a short time in this case. It's truly hard to keep up. Obviously, with every Tom, Dick and Harry living in her house, Nancy left with just a few bags and slept in her car for a couple of weeks until she could figure something out, while Ralf and his wife are sleeping, I guess, in her bed, probably. Then on July 24th, 2000, Nancy and Ralf would appear in court to finalise the injunction that she'd taken out against him. Nancy showed up super nervous, knowing that if this hearing didn't go in her favour, she would have nothing. She needed her house back. Ralf had taken all of Nancy's savings. He had threatened her, assaulted her. There was huge call logs that she'd made to the police with domestic violence complaints. It was very, very clear that this man was dangerous and relentless. Nancy needed him legally kept away from her for her safety. She told the court how he's frequently violent, and earlier that month had chased me with a knife and made threats about taking my life, the way he was going to torture me. He spent a couple of hours telling me how he would kill me and my whole family, and he was trying to think of a way to do it. And thank God the judge sided in Nancy's favour. He rightfully granted her sole ownership of the house and a restraining order against Ralf Panitz. For the first time in ages, Nancy could actually breathe. Everyone would have to vacate her house that same day, and her life could actually start to look normal again. She could begin her healing if he was out of her house and out of her life. Ralf walked out of court weirdly calm. There was no yelling, no tantrum, no swearing, but that was far from how he actually felt. When he next saw Eleanor, he turned to her and said, "I'm going back to the house to kill Nancy." At first, Eleanor just kind of thought this was like an insane, like emotional comment, putting it down to the fact that he was just pissed off and saying crazy shit. But as the day went on, she grew more and more worried about it. Eleanor and the random nephew were escorted back to the house to go and get their shit out, but obviously because Ralf had a restraining order now against him, he wasn't allowed to go and get his own stuff. In fact, he just headed to a local bar for a drink as Eleanor and the nephew were packing up. It wasn't even late in the day, by the way. Reports say it was like 10:30, 11 a.m., which, to be turning to the bottle first thing in the morning, gives you some indication of where Ralf is at mentally. So now, day drinking, alone in the bar, on the TV in the corner, guess what starts to play? The Jerry Springer episode. So Ralf sits, drink in hand, watching the entire show, getting more and more drunk and more agitated. He was staggering around the pub and people were really noticing him. And then at one point he turned to another guy sitting in the bar, pointed at Nancy on the TV and said, "I'm gonna kill her." And then he leaves. He's drunk as a skunk by this point as he walks to Nancy's house. He's staggering into the road without a care, almost like he genuinely wants to be knocked down. When he arrives at the house, that he's certainly not allowed to be at, by the way, Eleanor and the nephew are still packing up their shit. And instead of shooing him away like they probably should have done, they instead invite him into the house to take a nap and sleep off the alcohol. But soon after, a police car pulled up with Nancy in it. Time was up. They had to be out. This was Nancy's home now, like it always should have been, honestly. And knowing Ralf would already be in serious trouble for being at that house, Eleanor and the nephew tried to sneak him out of a back window so that he can make a run for it. The plan was for him to go and wait at a nearby 7-Eleven down the road, and they would pack up their stuff and come and pick him up in the car. But while Eleanor loaded up the car with all their stuff, she starts to get a gut feeling that something awful is going to happen. Ralf wasn't going to stay away from the house. She just knew it, and she couldn't shake off what Ralf had said earlier when he was leaving court, that he was going to kill Nancy. So they drove a little bit, but Eleanor just couldn't get this out of her head. She couldn't get it out of her head. So she turned the car around to head back to the house to make sure that Ralf wasn't getting himself into trouble. But it was too late. Ralf was already at Nancy's house, knowing for a fact that she would be there alone now. Somehow, He had forced his way in and ambushed her. He attacked her in the kitchen and dragged her down to the floor, where he began to beat her and strangle her. Nancy tried to put up a fight. She tried to fight back, scratching at his face, trying everything that she could to wiggle free from his grasp. But then he stood up. He was too far away to reach as he repeatedly stomped on her face, on her head, on her neck, 18 individual times. Nancy's skull was crushed. She was weak. She was beaten. She was bleeding. And with that, Ralf Panitz left her for dead and made a run from the house for the final time. Within moments of him leaving, Eleanor and the nephew had arrived there at the house, hoping that he hadn't acted on his anger. It was actually the nephew that ran up to the door and knocked on it, but no one came. He was very concerned immediately because, well, they'd just seen Nancy arrive at the house. She'd just been brought back less than an hour ago, so she should be answering the door, right? Well, if everything was okay, she should be answering the door. So the nephew starts trying to, push the door open, but it felt like it was barricaded. And he, too, had a really bad feeling about this. So he ran back out to where Eleanor would have been waiting in the car, but she was gone. So, he was confused, but again, he had a really bad feeling about this, and so he didn't think about Eleanor right now. He just ran to one of the neighbours' houses to call 911. Sorry, 999. I'm too British for this. He called 99. No, he didn't. He called 911. God. Okay, the nephew called 911, and by 6:30, police had arrived. They kicked in the front door and ran in to discover that they were too late. 52-year-old Nancy Campbell had been murdered in her own home. Her body lay in a pool of her own blood on the kitchen floor. She was hardly recognizable as Nancy anymore. Her face was crushed in so badly, 18 shoe prints stamped across her face and her neck. Responding officers who had been in the force for a long time said that this was one of the worst scenes they had ever encountered. It was just so brutal, so savage, so sudden. But where the fuck was Ralf Panitz? It was clear that he was the main suspect, and police feared that he could be a danger to more people if he wasn't captured quickly. Well, it turns out that when Eleanor had driven away, leaving the nephew at the house looking for Nancy, she had actually been looking for Ralf around the block, and she found him, just wandering the streets. She beckoned him into the car, and, he was probably still covered in Nancy's blood, and together, the two of them made a run for it. But before we get any further with them, I'd just like to take a minute just to honour Nancy and spotlight an incredible organisation that helps women in situations like hers. When Nancy was eventually buried back in her home state of Michigan, her family asked that instead of buying flowers for her, could people please donate to local domestic violence shelters in her memory instead? And today's charity provides a direct catalogue of all domestic violence shelters in the US and Canada. On domesticshelters.org, you simply type in your city or your zip code into their search engine, and a list of potential shelters will be provided. You can access all of their details, their contact information, and they can even tailor results to suit your language needs. So if you're living in the US or Canada and you ever need the safety of a shelter, or you know someone that might one day need one, please keep this website saved. I think it's so useful, it's so informative, and it's so important. Now, with all that being said, let's continue, because right now, Nancy's murderer was on the run. Of course, police were only looking for one guy, and Eleanor, but when it came to capturing Nancy's killer, it had to be the man that had made her life hell for years, the man that she'd continually reported for violence and abuse towards her. Police had spoken with the neighbours as well at this point, and one of them reported seeing, more like hearing, something suspicious just 30 minutes before the police would arrive and find Nancy dead. This neighbour had seen Eleanor and Ralf arguing outside, presumably when she'd, found him on the side of the street. And while a lot of what was being said was quite hard to make out, this neighbour did hear Eleanor say, "Ralf, please don't do this." The two of them ended up hopping in the car and driving away, where Ralf apparently told Eleanor that yes, he had been back to Nancy's house, but they had had just a verbal argument and nothing more. He said that Nancy had threatened to get him deported and he was panicking. I'm not sure how much of this Eleanor actually believed, but she wanted to help him if that was the case. So they decided to drive off to Maine, which, if you know your US state geography, you already know that that's fucking insane. It's literally the total opposite end of the country. They would just be driving north and north and north for like 24 hours straight. But Maine was their choice for whatever reason. Oh, in fact, I think I know the reason. Ain't that where Canada is? They planned to flee to Maine and lay low for a while until it all hopefully blew over. Did Eleanor know at this point that Ralph was a murderer? I'm not sure. She says not. But surely he had blood all over his shoes from stomping Nancy's head in 18 fucking times. I find it very hard to believe that there weren't physical signs or even signs in the way that Ralph was acting. But during their drive to Maine, Eleanor and Ralph came up with a plan to make a break for the Canadian border, of course. Ralph, being German, intended to seek refuge at the German embassy, while Eleanor, a Native American, could attempt to reach a Canadian reservation. Basically, both of them were plotting separate escape plans. But if Eleanor thought that this was just a verbal agreement and it was about deportation, then why was she agreeing to do such drastic fucking measures to get them both out of the country and somewhere else? I don't know. It's almost like she knew it was way more serious than what Ralph had told her. Meanwhile, police are trying their best to track down the two of them, who had clearly gone on the run. They were uncontactable and not in any of the places that they were known to go. So police put out an alert across the country, naming both of them as the two wanted people in connection with the murder of Nancy Campbell-Panitz. So now they're pretty much fucked. The story blew up everywhere. Headlines were calling it the Jerry Springer killing. Eleanor and Ralph were labelled fugitives. Their faces were everywhere. Every headline, every TV channel, plastered all over the news. It was a total media circus. And after 4 days, Eleanor and Ralph actually turned themselves into authorities on the 28th of July, where they would be held without bail. Eleanor was eventually released on bond and never charged with anything in relation to Nancy's death. It became clear quite quickly to the police that Ralph was solely responsible for the actual physical attack on Nancy, so instead Eleanor would now serve the police as a material witness, which is low-key crazy to me because she was helping him try to flee the entire fucking country. But since she maintained that she had no idea about the murder and she thought that he was just fleeing from deportation, then she managed to get off lightly. And I think get off lightly is an understatement for that. She was going to help him get away with murder, is in my opinion. But Ralph was, of course, charged with Nancy's murder. He was still wearing the trainers that he had stomped all over her head in and crushed her skull with. They had her DNA all over them. He was done. Further to that, the soles of his shoes matched the prints found on the floor at the scene, and his DNA was found under Nancy's fingernails. And now that the killer had been caught and the announcement had been made, everyone was desperate to see what kind of reaction Jerry Springer and the show as a whole would have. To invite this turbulent couple onto the show, rile them up, and then send them off back again with no protection, something like this was bound to happen at some point with something that happened on the show. And Jerry Springer himself stayed rather quiet on the matter, even though there were paparazzi literally camping outside of his house to get his take on it. And he did briefly answer a couple of questions, but it was mainly along the lines of like, well, what does this have to do with me? When he was asked by reporters if he even remembered the guests, he straight up just said no.
Do you remember those people at all?
No.
And like, I'm calling bullshit on that because it was only 2 fucking months ago. What are you, a goldfish? If he really, you know what, if he really truly did not remember Nancy or Ralph, then that just shows how little Jerry Springer and the rest of the production do not give a single fuck about the people that they exploit for ratings, for money, for views. This woman had lost her life in such a horrific way, and this show was very much a contributing factor, and he couldn't even just fucking lie, like make something up, say something nice about her. He really didn't give a shit, and it's disgusting. And this didn't go down well at all. In fact, things with the show had gotten really messy, and it was actually about to get subpoenaed, meaning that they were going to be called to give evidence or interviews. Basically, anything the police and the courts required, they would need to give, which they did not want to do, because that could land them in lawsuits and all sorts of fucking issues. I don't know. If the prosecution decided to pull them in and put the blame on them for the murder, I mean, obviously that's bad. I don't know why I was going to try and explain to you why that's bad. So, what does the show do in response? Well, the entire crew that had worked on Nancy's episode were carted off to Jamaica to go and film a new show about a swingers resort. They were basically removed from the reach of police and the courts. I just think it's wild. What a coincidence that every single person that investigators might want to question just happened to be out of the country in Jamaica, all at the same time. Even Jerry Springer himself. What the fuck are you doing over there? Your studio's in Chicago. It's almost as if they knew that they had a part to play in this devastating case, and they wanted no risk of the courts proving that. They wanted to wash their hands of this. Ralph's trial took place 2 years later, in March 2002, and obviously it goes without saying the case against him was so strong. But you're not gonna believe the argument that Ralph's lawyers tried to spin. It's actually fucking egregious. They tried to say that Nancy had died of a heart attack during a fight with some random person that had broken into her house. So let me get this straight. Someone else came into her house to beat her until she was unrecognizable, but that's not what killed her. It was a heart attack. Right. So how are we going to explain Ralph's DNA at the scene and Nancy's DNA all over his fucking shoes? Honestly, his defense was so shit. And it's funny because Ralph had gone and hired a pretty famous celebrity lawyer called Jeffrey Fieger. And he even used forensic scientists that had been called in for the O.J. Simpson case. This was supposed to be a solid team, so what the fuck are they doing? It's actually laughable. Eleanor actually took the stand in floods of tears, and she acknowledged how there was a lot of hatred between Ralph and Nancy, but she swore that he never murdered her. Luckily, the jury didn't believe a single word of it, and after 18 hours of deliberation split across 2 days, on the 26th of March 2002, Ralf Panitz was found guilty of the second-degree murder of Nancy Campbell-Panitz. He was also convicted of violating the domestic violence injunction issued the same day that Nancy was killed, and for all of this, he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. And then the judge extended her wrath to the Jerry Springer show as well, saying that they had brought out all 3 of these guests just to manipulate and humiliate them. She went in on the producers, asking if ratings were really more important than the dignity of human life, ending her speech with, "Shame on you." The executive producer for Jerry Springer was actually asked in an interview where he draws the line when it comes to using people for TV, and he replied, "Oh, I would not. There's no line to draw. If I could kill someone on television, if I could execute them on television, I would execute them on television." What a barbaric thing to say. And so fucking dystopian as well. And I worry that he is genuinely serious about that. If he could do it and he wouldn't get into trouble for it, the views that would pull in would be worth way more than a human life to these big bucks execs. On the 10th of July in 2002, Nancy's son filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Jerry Springer, the producers, and the show's distributor, claiming that the episode set the stage for Nancy's murder. The lawsuit claims that producers tricked Nancy into going onto the show and even encouraged Ralph to lie to her so that they could ambush her on air with the revelation that he'd secretly married Eleanor, all for ratings. It also says that producers greenlit Nancy's appearance on the show despite knowing that there was a whole pile of domestic violence accusations between her and Ralph. They saw the red flags and ignored them because they wanted a good storyline. Springer's team clapped back, saying that the murder had happened almost 3 months after the taping, making it completely unrelated to them. But come on now. Heartless and senseless, it seems. But now, here's the problem with this lawsuit. To win this case, they would have to convince a jury that if Springer never aired that episode, then Nancy would still be alive. Well, unfortunately, this case did seem like a ticking time bomb regardless of the Jerry Springer show. I think we can all agree that the way things panned out, it very much was a big contributing factor in the murder. But who's to say that if the show never happened, Ralph wouldn't have lost it and killed Nancy one day anyway. In 2003, Nancy's son dropped this lawsuit and received nothing, not even recognition for his mother's wrongful death. The murder didn't hurt Jerry Springer or the show. The ratings stayed pretty much the same. The show never accepted responsibility for Nancy's death. They never even apologized. They just carried on like it wasn't their mess. They really had gotten away with contributing to murder, in my eyes, in my opinion, allegedly. You know? The show was eventually cancelled in 2018 after low ratings and stricter rules kind of stripped away the scandal of the show. God, all these measures to protect people and their mental health, it's just ruining the fun, isn't it? Jerry Springer himself actually passed away in 2023, age 79, by which time it was estimated he was worth around $60 million. Crazy. As for Ralph and Eleanor, well, they're actually still together to this day. Eleanor visits Ralph in prison often, and I guess she finally got her way. Ralph is hers. But only because Nancy's life was taken in the most horrific, brutal way. She had been put through so much abuse, so much humiliation and violence by these two. But despite this, Nancy carried herself well on that show, and she walked off with her dignity intact while everyone else's was left shattered all over the floor. Though she may have been the villain in Springer's story, she truly was the hero in her own. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Outlaw Podcast. And thanks again to MyHeritage for sponsoring. Remember, there's a 14-day free trial waiting for you to uncover your family law and build that tree. You can scan the QR code on screen right now, or you can click the link down below in the description to begin your free trial today. If you're watching on YouTube, please leave us a thumbs up and leave us a comment down below so that we can continue the conversation. Me and the team love reading you guys' comments. If you're listening on a podcast platform, also leave us a comment. I know they have those on the podcast platforms these days. And leave us a 5-star rating, please. But hey, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!